I want to talk about aesthetics. So 2020 was a lot. I'm in Melbourne, which presented incredibly interesting. During stage 4 lockdown, we couldn't leave the house for anything non-essential, but the job I work at was deemed essential. So I worked all the way through lockdown. This forced me to exercise an extreme level of cognitive dissonance, where on one hand, I was still interacting with people during isolation, but the interactions were purely superficial. I'd work and talk with the public and witness shifts in being, the changes in behaviour, opinions and aesthetics as restrictions would change. Masks were made mandatory, sanitizer, social distancing, blah blah blah. But what happened during this time was that because I couldn't leave my home for any other reason, it became a kind of concentrated microcosm to what was going on in the world. This concentration, this fishbowl of experience and thoughts really brought my awareness to the true nature of aesthetics. I'm still grappling with this thought, but my general vibe right now is that aesthetics have entirely oversaturated our world experience, and it may be the case that we can't experience anything beyond it. So, I'm sure this sounds incredibly familiar to anyone familiar with Jean Baudrillard. But just in case you don't, Simulacra and simulation speaks of reality collapsing onto itself. That there's a simulation, a hyper-real reality, which is presented to us through the media. What I've witnessed and what Baudrillard speaks of is this hyper-reality taking over reality to the point where you can't tell which is the simulacra and which is the real or original state. This is achieved by the simulation taking everything that makes up reality and concentrating it into the surface. There's nothing beyond this surface, but because of the quickening cycle of the media, we can never fixate on it long enough to realize this. There are many who have built upon this idea and offer their own concepts on top of this. The most recent books I've read, and ones I'll be referencing here, is Guy Debord's Society of the Spectacle and Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism. But before I get into this, I want to first expand upon what the hell I'm actually talking about when I say this video is about aesthetics. There's an episode of Daria where she needs to learn how to drive but can't see properly with her glasses, so she has to get contact lenses. She gets compliments on her not wearing glasses, which puts her into a moral dilemma of aesthetics, where she starts to like the compliments and how she looks without glasses. It's one I think many of us have had to deal with, which is this feeling that caring about your appearance is immoral or means you're shallow. In the episode, her Aunt Amy essentially says, who cares? Vanity is unavoidable, changing things just gives you different options on how to look. It doesn't change your personality or values. The episode influenced me so much as a teenager until really this year I was wrestling with morality regarding aesthetics. I consciously showed myself in a way which rejected the notion and would then judge others who lived by aesthetic values. Now I realize that this pseudo-morality is as much as an aesthetic stance as what I was opposing. There's no escaping the spectacle. Regardless of where you choose to sit, is a decision made within the confines of it. You can never escape the game. Choosing not to play is just another option within it. Like, for example, when I not wear branded clothes or not wear makeup, you're projecting an aesthetic commitment to truth and to be an honest person with an intellectual integrity, which is obviously bullshit, because it's still a commitment to aesthetics through rejection. A commitment through rejection is still an aesthetic stance because it's an acknowledgement that aesthetics are prevalent and important. I feel now that this rejection is more problematic because it's intertwining a morality into this vapid aspect of the self, essentially giving it more power and not just allowing it to exist as it is, but mixing it up with one's being and values. By doing so, you're mixing up perspectives. I think to avoid these traps, which work to invert your views onto themselves, you should project different perspectives to individuals and to society as a whole. By judging those who demonstrate a consciousness towards aesthetics, you're only fueling its importance and being self-defeating to your own moral stance. I say this because based on my observations and experiences this year, I'm starting to fundamentally shift my worldview. From what I've seen, I'm really questioning whether this concentrated state of aesthetics has changed our entire perspective in an ontological sense. I'm starting to think that no matter how empathetic you try to be as a human, there's a fundamental incapacity to think from another's perspective. Everything we experience as reality is a turntable of our own views and what is put onto us through what was previously community and is now the media. So what we consume or see is internalized and projected back out in an endless cycle, which I would argue gets more and more one-dimensional each time it goes through the cycle because it becomes more and more manufactured from a one point of view. In the Society of the Spectacle, Guy Debord speaks of the spectacle, which is another form of Baudrillard's simulacra, not being just an image, but being an image which is then used to negate social relations between people. He suggests that as a result, objective reality absorbs the spectacle and realigns itself with it. The image absorbs and imitates reality, which is then used as a point of reference to live by. This is, of course, invasive. The spectacle uses its habitual absorption and imitation to then commodify the human state. This, in addition to the constantly moving state of the spectacle, means that we have no option but to identify as the commodity, because nothing exists outside of it. This is why I say that objecting to aesthetics is worse than just accepting aesthetics for what they are. By intertwining aesthetics into morality, you're taking what is a complex system of invasive media and internalizing them to such an extent that they change your view of yourself and others. To be clear, I think this would be the case anyway. I think it's inescapable. But at least by acknowledging it and participating on a level which is fitting, you can tame it. You can't avoid participation, which is why it must be conscious. By drawing a line within yourself and acknowledging that this means everything and nothing simultaneously, you can reach some kind of calm within yourself. Okay. This is where it gets complicated. Mark Fisher's capitalist realism speaks of something that's been spoken about for some time now, which is the big other. I'm still trying to figure out what exactly the big other is, in the same way I'm still trying to figure out what postmodernity is. Like, I know in theory, but in terms of absorption, it's something I'm grappling with. Whether it's such a fugitive idea that by writing about it, you can't catch it and you're endlessly chasing the idea. Anyway, Fisher speaks of the big other by describing it as what is essentially the gap between what we identify with, like when Debord says we identify as the commodity, and this kind of global consciousness that we can never identify with. Hence the term the big other. The big other is elusive to grasp, but dictates what is the general attitude in its population. I say attitude because it's all-encompassing. Like the hyperreal that Baudrillard speaks of, it's a quiet and autonomous dictatorship which works in a circle. It tells us how to feel, we absorb it, and then we tell it how to feel, and the cycle goes on again. I'm speaking of this because I think it's imperative when speaking about the game of aesthetics. Because, and I think this is the most interesting part of the entire concept, the big other cannot be allowed to know about it. As soon as you acknowledge any effort you put into your appearance, you've broken the rules and are labelled as fake. The Society of the Spectacle must be autonomous, and because we identify as the commodities within the structure, we must also be autonomous. Everything that's demanded of us must be effortless. This is our natural state. We know it's effort and we know it's fake, yet if we openly declare it, we're typecast by the big other into this nebulous space of pure aesthetics. Example, Kendall and Kylie Jenner. They've both had the same amount of work done, yet one's deemed natural. Why? Because she doesn't declare it. Once it's declared, that becomes your identity. You can care, but if you look like you care, then that's all you are. You're sucked into the purest state of hyperreality, where you become identified as that and nothing else. This is how the big other sees it, and this is how we see it, because we're products of that othering. As Fisher describes, media now is a system of guidance. It tells us what to feel, not what to think. By doing so, we harbour agreed upon reactions as the highest point of authority, becomes a system not of moral guidance, but of emotional guidance. Morality replaced by feeling. I think the aesthetic state we're presented with is a symptom of a guidance system which cannot manifest anything of contemplative value. Aestheticism is the embodiment of hyperreality, where the empire of the self is realized, where we're trapped within ourselves. If we identify as the commodities we're presented with and are trapped within ourselves, then no wonder all we consume is of aesthetic value. I'm beginning so far as to wonder whether humanity has been altered by the media to the extent that we can't fully exist as human within its presence. If that even when we attempt deep thinking or pure being, we cannot. But we wouldn't know that because it feels like we are. But are our feelings valid if they've been guided from birth? There's that dumb old philosophical thought experiment. If a tree falls in the forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? Well, I truly don't think it does. And I'm beginning to wonder if the tree exists at all beyond human perception. I think that the big other speaks to this and why aestheticism is so rampant at the moment. Besides the obvious patriarchal and capitalist overtones of it all, aesthetics seems to be a kind of subconscious acknowledgement of a deep unknowing, a kind of coming to terms with or giving up the quest for truth or what is real. This is of course coming from the big other, a kind of detached but participatory social knowing. This otherness is manifesting this hyperreal aestheticism present in ourselves and in the media we consume. The absorption of the self into the hyperreal or spectacle is a natural state to be in when presented with this manufactured perspective. Now we're in a space where awareness of this trap is emerging, yet the big other is still oblivious to it. I don't really know what my point is. I think my point is that caring too much about your appearance is a symptom of a much wider happening. I know that acknowledging the vanity in consumer culture that aestheticism derives from seems like the right thing to do, and it is if you're doing so to highlight a global slavery system and trying to do something about it, like only buying ethically made products. But getting morally invested in aesthetics itself is a trap. It seems like the right thing to do, but it's so much more. All you're doing is devaluing your morals by lowering them to the shallows and deepening the effects that aesthetics have by elevating them to a place where they don't belong. At the end of the day, regardless of our current conditioning, humans can't perceive anything outside themselves. So I cannot see you beyond your aesthetic value, which includes your general demeanor and attitude. The faster the circular cycle of hyperreality, consumption, and spectacle gets, the more that is the case. And the more we need to work to separate our ontological selves and the commodity values that they're intertwined with. I hope this made an ounce of sense. Thanks.